the cliched question now, of course, I want to ask you, what's your perspective on leadership? So we've got two stylized versions, leaders are made or leaders are born. But so you're a leader, how do you think about doing it yourself? But how do you identify and cultivate leaders in a large organization?
So, and again, this will be a Vanguard perspective. I think there are a couple of models out there that have been successful for other organizations. So the big, like any company, we have a set of competencies. There's 6 or 7 attributes that you look for in leaders. Jeff and his team talk about this stuff in all the Wharton classes. I find that mildly interesting and useful.
It's a great program.
Yeah. No, I'm gonna come back to what they do. They've gone beyond this. So every company has these competencies, and and we all try to put unique names on it. But at the end of the day, you're sort of looking for basic. Somebody's smart. Do they work hard? Do they have impact? What's their track record in developing people, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are fine. I mean, those are, in a sense, you got to have those. For us, we've really gravitated to a model that's very team-oriented, and I like to call it a high-performing team model. And there's, again, I don't want to overuse any athletic analogies.
We can get there in a second.
Jeff and I have a lot of conversation on this, but what we're looking for are people who have tremendous individual drive and the ability to be great team members. And from my perspective, so what we look for, we look for people who can come together on I'll call it a shared vision. There's clarity about what you're trying to do. We want people who trust each other, because we think if there's not tremendous trust, you can't have open debate. And again, it sounds a little cliche, but I actually think about, I call it the foxhole test. Would I be comfortable with somebody having my back in the foxhole? So you got to have that trust. You got to have that debate. You got to hold each other accountable, and I think that's actually the hardest part in the way we think about it. Is if you and I have set out to do something and it's not getting done appropriately, we've got to be willing to call each other out on it. And then the last component, and arguably the most important, is, I think trust is the most important. So the second most important is you got to be driven by results. So this isn't about feeling good about being on a team and so forth. It's you have this vision, and then you have to be able to translate that vision into what the results are going to be, and you have to be really passionate.
Now I know why you gave me the book about Australian sporting legends to read. Right. So I have to try to make a joke now, which would sound much better if everyone had an Australian accent than it will tonight. So the joke, and then I'll decode it for you, is that Bill is an awesome athlete. Now, of course, in Australia that's spelt OAR as well as AWE, so we have a famous Australian rowing team called the Awesome Foursome. It wouldn't sound as good if it was the Arsome Farsome or something like that. But so I know now why you wanted me to read this book, which I really enjoyed because there was so much of my childhood in it. But when we think about competitive sport, particularly team-based sport, there are multiple dimensions, and I just wanted you to reflect on all of them. So one is teamwork. You've already mentioned that, but there are at least 2 others that people talk about. Resilience, right? You've got to deal with loss, and competition. You've got to think that competition's healthy. So do we draw straight lines from your rowing background into what it takes to be a good leader, or are the lines a bit more complicated than that?
So I think it's a little more complicated. Look, I think the perseverance thing is absolutely right. And actually, there's a Penn professor who's done, I think, the best work on this. Angela Duckworth, many of you probably know, is written on what she calls a very scientific term, grit. And it's all about perseverance. And I believe she's really got the right ideas in terms of the importance of grit. If we could actually test for that proactively, I think we would identify a lot of very successful people and successful leaders. The love of competition is useful, but I'll tell you what has been more useful, at least in our experience, is, and again, it's a little bit related to some of Angela's work. She did a lot of work with a Stanford psychologist by the name of Carol Dweck, who I guess about a decade ago or so wrote a book called Mindset. And it's this idea that you can have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And there's like no correlation between people who have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset and IQ or EQ or any of those other, those standard measures. So you can have brilliant people with very fixed mindsets. And the growth mindset is you're always willing to learn. You're always willing to absorb, and you actually consider that sort of part of your mission.
So in the sports world, that's enjoying training, I guess, right?
It is. It's constantly getting better. So, if you were going to use the sports analogy, you'd look at a guy like Michael Jordan, who when he came out of college was this phenomenal athlete, but then spent 6 hours a day in the gym in the off season perfecting things that he wasn't as good at.
And he was cut from his high school basketball team as a freshman.
Yeah. So
and wherever it was, Wilmington, North Carolina.
But that combination of grit and a growth mindset, I think, are very important traits for leadership. And if you combine that with this sort of a very dynamic, high-performing team concept, at least that's what we're trying to do.
Last question. So the forward in the book you sent me is by an Australian athlete called Herb Elliott. And this is a guy who's a walk on water in Australia because he never lost at the 1,500 metres, and he won the Olympic gold medal by more than 20 metres, something that I don't think has ever happened.
It's never happened again.
But he says something in this book that I found very interesting. Somebody asked him the question, how should you think about your own performance? And he said, I don't believe, I can't do his Australian accent, I don't believe any of this stuff about be the best you can be. That's for wimps, I think he would have said. He said, you've got to get out there and have measurable metrics of performance so that you and everybody else can see if you made it or not. Do you think he's right about that? Or is the, be the best person you can be a better way to think about our own development?
So, I actually pondered that quote when I first read the book. It's a book that was put out in preparation for the 2000 Olympics. And basically, Australia, as you know, was hosting, and Herb Elliott won his gold medal in Melbourne in 1956. And he led a group of athletes around the country giving talks and sort of seminars. And the idea was to try to take all these lessons for preparing for this great Olympic Games and apply them more broadly to life. And that quote, I actually went back and forth a little bit on that.
So did
Jeff.
yeah.
I would tell you, so it's going to sound like a cop-out. I think it's both. I do think you have to have this sort of self-actualization concept about trying to be the best you can be. But some of my colleagues who are in the audience at Vanguard know we talked about being, we had our internal, what do we want to be? And we talked about being a great place to work and a great place to invest. And I had a lot of people say, that's great, so what's that look like? And I'd say, well, and I'd sort of try to describe it. And finally, I put 4 numbers up on the board a few years ago as representative. I said, if we hit these 4 metrics, there'll be a lot more underneath it. But if we hit these 4 metrics, we will be a great place to work, and we will be a great place to invest by definition. And it's amazing how that focused in everybody's attention. And so I actually do think there's, I think metrics are a good thing.